It doesn't really matter what degree you know of Puroresu. If you know it, you know these two names. Giant Baba and Antonio Inoki. Arguably the two biggest stars in the whole history of Japanese wrestling. The only other person who's up there is the guy who trained them. You know Baba and Inoki as the founders of All Japan and New Japan Pro Wrestling respectively. You may know that they used to team together at one stage when they were younger, and you may also know that they didn't really like each other, putting it mildly. Baba and Inoki turned out to be, well, completely different people. But where did the differences between the pair come from? Because it wasn't always that way. We're talking about two wrestlers who didn't just come up together, they trained together and made their wrestling debuts on the exact same night. Baba and Inoki, in another world, could have been thick as thieves rather than chalk and cheese. Still, fate and pro wrestling had other ideas. To tell the story of how things between Giant Baba and Antonio Inoki turned so sour, we have to go back to a time long before New Japan and All Japan. Both Baba and Inoki are gone now, but we must turn back the clock to a time when they were young and fresh-faced. The nature of how the careers of Baba and Inoki played out, particularly in the 1960s, when they both wrestled for the Japanese Pro Wrestling Alliance, or JWA, doesn't just tell the tale of how they ended up being huge rivals at the helm of opposing promotions. It tells the story of how both men built the foundations of their entire character and pro wrestling philosophy. Exactly what they would call on when, in the early 1970s, they both built major promotions based around their vision of what pro wrestling should be. We'll start at a time when, well, neither of them were even in the dojo. Naturally, this story, at least in the beginning, will feature Rikidozan, the icon, the father of pro res, the most influential figure of them all, and one of the most popular. In his time, he was a hero. Rikidozan may not have been the first person to bring pro wrestling to Japanese shores. There were several women's wrestling exhibitions in the late 1940s for a start, won by Mildred Burke, but Rikidozan, as a wrestler, saw fit to carry a nation's wounded identity on his shoulders in the years after World War II, defeating a long line of American wrestlers from 1951 onwards. The names would get bigger and bigger as the decade went on. He founded the JWA, and by the time he wrestled a series of bouts against Lou Thesz, he was already an icon. One particular match from this Thesz series drew a quite ludicrous rating. 87% of all Japanese TV owners watched it. As much as Rikidozan is like that of a star that burns ridiculously brightly for a pretty short length of time, such were his achievements, it's also a tale of a tough man, someone who didn't exactly come from an advantageous background, who took no prisoners and certainly had a good few connections to the underworld. He was not ethnic Japanese. In fact, he was born Kim Sin-rak in 1924 in Korea, specifically in South Hamgyong province, which is now part of the DPRK. He moved to Japan in 1940 and took the name Mitsuhiro Momota, but in Japanese society he was classed as a Zainichi Korean, or a Korean in Japan. Zainichi Koreans faced a lot of discrimination and had significantly less rights than Japanese citizens, particularly following World War II, and Rikidozan was not exempt from this. Still, not long after he entered sumo in 1940, where he took the name of Rikidozan, a story was kind of concocted that presented him as being born in Omura, Nagasaki. Rikidozan did very well as a rikishi through the 1940s, achieving as high a rank as sekiwake. However, he made the surprise decision to retire in 1950. Sources differ as to why he made the decision. Some say that his Korean heritage meant that the association would have never promoted him higher than sekiwake, while others say that he actually was being considered for a promotion to Azeki, the last rank below Yokozuna, at the time of his retirement. Rikidozan did some odd jobs, primarily selling black market goods to American GIs, for a short time, before an American promoter and wrestler, Bobby Bruns, enticed him to the ring during a tour of Japan in 1951. The rest, as they say, is history. Over the following years, Rikidozan would quickly build a huge following despite his relative inexperience. He may not have had the wrestling skill of someone like Lou Thesz, but he had a certain fire, a knack for the big comeback perhaps, usually with many chops and his signature kesagiri, a chop to the brain. Seeing as an American tour brought him to the squared circle, Rikidozan was trained in a wholly American style of pro wrestling where that fiery comeback, paired with his natural toughness, would see him shine. And by the time that he formed the JWA in 1954, he was already a well-known star. He was also a hard-living man, a very heavy partier and drinker, one who would quite often get into brawls and almost seemed to revel in being boorish. This is a man who, if he felt that someone was wasting his time in a conversation, would register his disinterest by pulling down his pants and masturbating. And yes, he most certainly had a temper, one that he would at times be required to channel in the ring. One of the most famous early Rikidozan matches, a 1954 bout against partner-turned-rival and famed judoka Masahiko Kimura, would be one of the earliest pro-res matches that turned into a shoot. Kimura looked to expose the business in the build-up, saying that Rikidozan's hard image was pure showbiz compared to his legitimate background. 15 minutes into their sellout main event, Kimura hit Rikidozan in the groin, at which point they both started firing live rounds. Rikidozan responded with several hard chops and kicks, sending Kimura crumpling and causing him to win a match that beforehand the pair had agreed to draw. Or at least, that's what Kimura thought they'd agreed on, anyway. Although he entered the ring less as the 60s came along, Rikidozan matches would still attain huge attention, and they'd often be hard-hitting affairs. A series of bouts with Freddie Blassie, nicknamed Vampire in the Japanese press due to his excessive biting, were so violent that they caused several old men watching to die of heart failure. That is, if you bought into Blassie's gloriously kayfabe stories. One particular thing I always find amusing is that in 1961, Rikidozan fought a strongman from Canada. His name was Antonio Barichevich, but you likely know him as the Great Antonio. The bell rang and Antonio immediately started trying to shoot on Rikidozan, who promptly beat the shit out of him and ended the contest quickly, with Antonio getting beaten yet further in the locker room. And then, many years later, Antonio gets brought into New Japan to face Inoki as an old opponent of Rikidozan. He tries to do the same thing, and he gets the shit beaten out of him again in footage that's gone pretty viral over the years. Yes, Rikidozan also beat the crap out of the Great Antonio, 16 years before Inoki did. These are a few various facets of the man that was Rikidozan. To go through everything would obviously require a whole video of its own, and this is supposed to be a video about Giant Baba and Antonio Inoki. But these are famous events that make up the man, and Baba and Inoki are two wrestlers that, in a way, Rikidozan built. Despite everything else, one of the man's greatest legacies is as a trainer. Famous Rikidozan students include Kintaro Oki, who we'll be seeing more of in a bit, as he's one of JWA's top stars, Katetsu Yamamoto, a fine wrestler who would head New Japan's dojo from the 80s onwards, training a ridiculous amount of guys, Yoshiaki Fujiwara, Jushin Liger, Akira Maeda, Nobuhiko Takada, Shinsuke Nakamura, Prince Devitt and many more. Hiro Matsuda would go to America and also train many stars, Ted DiBiase, Scott Hall, Riki Choshu, Keiji Muto, many more besides, and, most famously of them all, Hulk Hogan. And then, even on top of all of that, you have Giant Baba and Antonio Inoki. In the early days of pro-res, there were two main pathways into pro wrestling. The main one, much like Rikidozan, was the path for former sumo wrestlers or rikishis, and the other one was a path for judokas and other martial artists. Most of the other native wrestlers in the JWA fit into the sumo path, such as the likes of Toyonobori and Azuma Fuji, the latter joining JWA in 1955, even after attaining the rank of Yokozuna in sumo. Neither Baba nor Inoki would really fit into this path of success in combat sports before pro wrestling. Inoki did learn karate when he was a child, while Baba didn't practice any martial art. Shohei Baba, who was born in 1938 and hailed from Niigata, was successful in sports, mind. That sport being baseball. He played for the Yomiuri Giants for 5 years as a pitcher, the biggest baseball team in the country. However, he would only ever play in 3 major league games before going down to the minors for more cultivation. Baba's time at the Giants came to an end in 1959, and unfortunately a severe arm injury soon after would curtail his professional baseball career. However, he did by this stage already know Rikidozan. They'd met at functions, and Rikidozan was pretty frickin' impressed by his size, seeing as Baba stood at around 6'8" due to gigantism, easily making him the biggest person to ever play Major League Baseball in Japan at that time. Rikidozan often encouraged Baba to give up baseball and come train pro wrestling with him, and after his baseball career ended, well, he decided to do exactly that. He did also have agents sniffing around who wanted to make him an actor or TV personality due to his height, but he chose to go the wrestling route. Inoki's pathway into wrestling was perhaps a bit more tricky due to where he ended up. Born in 1943 in Yokohama, Kanji Inoki's family moved to Sao Paulo in 1957, enticed by the opportunities there for Japanese emigres. While Inoki did learn karate as a child, as mentioned, his proficiency was on the track. The young Inoki was an excellent school athlete, breaking national shot put records in both Japan and Brazil. But it wasn't until 1960 when he'd have a chance meeting with Rikidozan, who was touring the country and had been made aware of the young Inoki's track exploits. Rikidozan met Inoki, examined his body, not as tall as Baba but still pretty damn big at over 6 foot and pretty strong, and just about immediately said to the young man that he should come back to Japan with him, soon rechristening him Antonio Inoki to allude to his time in Brazil and give him a bit more mystery as a wrestler. And so, the fate of both Inoki and Baba was sealed. They'd both start training at the JWA's dojo at virtually the same time. By this stage, Rikidozan was 35. More than a wrestler, he was a businessman with a great deal of other interests, not all of which were necessarily above board, and as such he was looking for those who could succeed him. Giant Baba and Antonio Inoki were presented as big deals even before they made their professional debuts. Rikidozan showed these young, strong and tall Japanese athletes to the press alongside another new wrestler, Kintaro Oki, a South Korean amateur wrestler who'd actually entered Japan illegally just to be trained by Rikidozan. Rikidozan's long-term plan was for Baba and Inoki to be cultivated so that they could hold the fort in Japan once he retired, while Oki would, he hoped, eventually be the star of a planned JWA expansion in South Korea. Inoki and Baba made their debut on the same night, September the 30th, 1960, again with significant fanfare. Baba actually won his first ever match against Yonitaro Tanaka, while Inoki lost to Oki, who'd made his debut a few months previously. Baba and Inoki would face off against each other a great deal in these early years. However, Inoki would never beat Baba, who won the lion's share of their matches, and the rest were drawn. With this in mind, it's fair to say that, of the two, Baba was considered to have the potential to be the biggest star in the eyes of JWA and Rikidozan. When it came time for the two wrestlers to mature further, their paths would again differ. In 1961, Giant Baba was to go further down the Rikidozan path, going on a big foreign excursion to the States in order to receive a proper American wrestling education. Inoki, meanwhile, was to stay in Japan. Essentially, he would be Rikidozan's assistant, learning directly from the boss. This wasn't necessarily the easiest time for Inoki. He would have to wait on Rikidozan hand and foot, the man was a harsh trainer, and yes, every so often, Inoki would have to take a beating if he made a mistake. Baba's own handler in the US, a man named Kazuo Okamura, but better known as Great Togo, would also often treat Baba harshly after matches, beating him with wooden shoes as a way of teaching him respect, something that tended to disgust the other people in the locker room. However, something a little unexpected happened with Baba in America. Obviously it was hoped he would succeed in both his performances and his training, but it wasn't quite as expected that he'd get so over. Baba was a hit in the States. In a time before Andre, he became the premier giant. He was very athletic at the time, especially for someone billed at 6'10", and he could work a lot better than many of the other more generic foreign heels that were kicking around. Before long, he was more than just a foil for the patriotic Americans in the traditional post-war themed home heroes versus evil foreigners bouts. Baba the Giant, as he was billed, was soon headlining cards against the top stars of the day, the likes of Bruno Sammartino, Buddy Rogers, Johnny Valentine, Freddie Blassie, and Lou Fez. Initially not earning a huge amount in his excursion despite his quick advance up the cards, his bookings soon became far too lucrative for that arrangement to stay put. By 1963, Bubba was a headline act all over America for both the NWA and Vince McMahon Sr.'s WWF, and he was earning pretty good cash in that role, although Great Togo was still presumably taking the lion's share. It is entirely plausible that Bubba could have held on to this arrangement long after any foreign excursion was due to end, perhaps even forever. However, fate had other ideas, and he would be forced into making a decision. So, we go to December the 8th, 1963. Rikidozan is still hugely popular when it comes to the ring. Feuds against the likes of Freddie Blassie and the Destroyer, Dick Bayer, attract huge crowds and TV audiences. His appetite for partying and drinking hadn't exactly been tempered. On this day he was a guest on a radio show and was, by all accounts, already quite drunk by that point. He also, on this day, makes a deal with a sumo stable master that would have seen Antonio Inoki become a sumo apprentice in exchange for his help in promoting a foreign tour, a deal that was very much against Inoki's will and almost caused him to quit, although he appeared accepting of it to Rikidozan. Following his radio appearance, he would spend the evening in a popular Tokyo night spot called the New Latin Quarter, which is where he would get into an altercation with a young Yakuza member named Katsushi Murata. The pair bumped into each other. Rikidozan shouted that he'd stepped on his foot, and then shoved and started beating Murata as he tried to defend himself. As he mounted the guy who bumped him to lay down more punishment, Murata produced a long knife and stabbed Rikidozan once in the left abdomen. Now, Rikidozan should obviously have gone to a hospital to get patched up properly, but he didn't want the media attention that would come with doing so. Instead, he was taken to an obstetrics hospital, where a gynecologist and surgeon he knew performed an outpatient procedure, repairing the holes in his small intestine. Despite the punctures, Rikidozan would have probably been fine had he rested for a while. Over the next couple of days, high-ranking members of Murata's clan came to Rikidozan's home to apologise profusely for the incident. Reportedly, even Murata himself, who took a further beating from his clan once he'd admitted what he'd done, came to apologise personally, and Rikidozan accepted those apologies. However, he wasn't resting. After the procedure, he basically continued drinking and eating heavily, just as before. A few days after the stabbing, Rikidozan's condition worsened dramatically, and he had to be rushed back to hospital for a second surgery. However, there wasn't much that could be done, and Rikidozan passed away on December the 15th at the age of 39, 1 week after the stabbing. The cause of death was internal hemorrhage and peritonitis. Murata, his assailant, would be charged with manslaughter and serve 7 years in prison, later making a visit every year to the grave of Rikidozan to apologise further until his own death in 2013. The shocking death of such a national hero poleaxed the country. 12,000 people would attend Rikidozan's funeral on December the 20th, and Lord knows how many saw his procession. Those close to him who knew the details could only mourn at how senseless and preventable his death was. Even those who knew the extent of his injury at the hands of that knife assumed that he would recover in due course, and given different choices, he more than likely would have. But in the months following the death of Rikidozan, the tragedy for JWA would give way to scandal. Rikidozan's popularity and heroic status acted as something of a shield for the ties that a lot of executive people in the company had with the underworld. Indeed, Rikidozan perhaps had the most of them all. He had many ties with organisations who had a lot of money in JWA, was always seemingly away whenever the heat started to rise, and was apparently a very paranoid man at the end of his life, often sleeping with a weapon close at hand. With Rikidozan now gone, 1964 would see the extent of those ties revealed in the press. These ties would cause sponsors and TV channels to drop the JWA. Toyonobori was quickly installed as the company's ace following Rikidozan's death, not to mention part of the company's leading counsel, but he couldn't stop the rot, and other executives in the company had issues with the amount of money that Toyonobori spent on gambling. Not necessarily morally, but they saw it more as an opening to oust him. It seemed inevitable that the house that Rikidozan had built would crumble with his death. In the eyes of the higher-ups at the JWA, there was only one person who had a chance of saving them. The JWA, now led by a council consisting of wrestlers Toyonobori, Yoshino Sato, Kokichi Endo and Michaki Yoshimura, made the call to Giant Baba, wanting him to come back. The JWA, in decline, could in no way guarantee that Baba was going to make as much money back in Japan as he was currently making in the States, and Baba's manager, Great Togo, was naturally in his ear telling him that he should stay abroad, JWA be damned. By this stage, Baba was headlining shows with Bruno Sammartino at MSG. The importance of this decision cannot be overstated. If Baba chose not to come back, JWA would have almost certainly been finished off. The entire history of Pro-Res would have completely changed. I'd say there's a fair argument for this decision being the most important in the whole history of pro wrestling in Japan. And of course, in spite of the potential success and money that was on offer in the US, Baba made the decision to return home. From April 1964, JWA will once again be Baba's home. And needless to say, he's got work to do, particularly as the cleanup of various figures with far too many underworld connections continues in the JWA. On his return, Baba essentially replaced Toyonobori, who didn't particularly get along with him, and was fast-tracked into the ace position, with Yoshino Sato also having a prime position on the card. 1965 is a year of slow rebuild, but it's also a year of upheaval. The four-wrestler council at the head of JWA doesn't work out. A dispute with Toyonobori over his loss of the ace position, as well as his tendency to gamble, eventually results in his ousting at the end of the year. And he decides to form a new promotion, poaching several members of the roster for Tokyo Pro Wrestling. And one of the guys he poached? Yep, Antonio Inoki. With any possibility of Inoki becoming an apprentice Rikishi removed by Rikidozan's death, he had been on his own foreign excursion since 1964. His trip was more typical than the success that Baba had, largely wrestling as a standard foreign heel named Tokyo Tom for the NWA and Central States, but the start of 1966 would see him rather dramatically switch over to this brand new promotion. He had several reasons, the main one being that Toyonobori was Inoki's best friend in the entire JWA setup and had been since his training days. When Rikidozan scolded and beat Inoki, Toyonobori was the one there to console him. With Toyonobori's ousting, Inoki felt his prospects in the JWA didn't look particularly good. Toyonobori basically said to him that everyone in the company was entirely behind Baba and he'd essentially be treated as an outsider in the JWA if he went back there. One other wild detail of this exercise: Toyonobori did this whole meeting in Hawaii at the same time that a JWA training camp was going on there, with Baba, the council, and everyone else in the same freaking location, and Inoki training with them. At the end of the camp, Inoki made an excuse as to why he couldn't go back with everyone else, and then the JWA was blindsided a few days later by Inoki returning on a plane with Toyonobori, announcing his arrival in the new Tokyo Pro Wrestling promotion. Just to add to all this tumult, another ousted JWA executive, Isao Yoshihara, would form another new promotion in the middle of 1966, the IWE, or International Wrestling Enterprise, with Hiro Matsuda. While all of this seems rather sensational, JWA were able to weather this initial storm. Tokyo Pro, despite featuring Toyonobori and Inoki, weren't able to gather all that much in the way of momentum, mainly due to the JWA's exclusive working relationship with the NWA, limiting their choice of foreign talent. The clean-up of JWA's image following the installation of Baba as top star was, by and large, working out. Baba was seen to be, and indeed was, thoroughly clean, while the JWA itself had thoroughly cooperated with various police investigations. Ridding the company of once very powerful executives with ties to the underworld wasn't exactly straightforward, and caused more than a few serious threats to come their way, but they weathered those too. Tokyo Pro, on the other hand, was hamstrung immediately by Toyonobori's aforementioned gambling vices. A successful October debut card featuring Inoki main eventing against Johnny Valentine was not followed up on, and soon enough the talent, including Inoki, became disgruntled by the company's mysteriously tight budget. The final straw occurred a mere month later. Inoki pulled out of a card at the last minute after Toyonobori took his performance fee for a show, breaking away immediately and even making steps to form a company with other disgruntled wrestlers back then. While this didn't occur, it's intriguing to think that New Japan could have possibly started there and then, 6 years before it actually did. With the friendship between Inoki and Toyonobori broken, the entire setup crumbled in legal scuffles, and eventually the remnants of Tokyo Pro merged with the newer promotion, the IWE, at the start of 1967. This outfit would last a great deal longer. Inoki, burned by this experiment, makes a deal at the start of the year to get back into JWA with other homegrown Tokyo Pro wrestlers. In the end, Inoki's standing in the JWA wasn't hurt a whole lot by his temporary switch. The narrative that they pushed from the beginning, even in the press, was that he'd been misled by Toyonobori, who'd taken advantage of the young Inoki, using his potential star power for his own gain. Indeed, when he made his proper return to JWA in 1967, he would soon be thrust into his biggest role to date. Rikidozan's two great chargers, the pair who debuted on the same night back in 1960, were about to join forces to take on the best tag teams that the USA could offer. The official return of Antonio Inoki to the JWA was announced in April of 1967. By this time, Baba was a champion both in singles and tag competition. He'd long held the NWA International Championship, the title that had originally belonged to Rikidozan, for 5 whole years and was won by Baba in November 1965 after beating Dick the Bruiser in a match for the vacant belt. Not only that, but he was the NWA International Tag Champ. He'd held that belt for over a year with the Fireball Kid, Michiaki Yoshimura. By this stage, JWA were happily back running shows in most of the major wrestling venues, old and new. They stopped using the venue that Rikidozan built, an arena-cum-entertainment palace-cum-office called the Ricky Sports Coliseum in 1966 as something of a break from the past, but they were regularly at the likes of the Dinen Coliseum and Kuame Kokukikan, the old sumo hall. At the end of 1966, JWA ran the very first Puroresu show at a pretty new location that had been built for the 1964 Tokyo Olympics, the Nippon Budokan, with Giant Baba defending his title against Fritz von Erich. I feel like there should be a bit of a note here when it comes to watching old JWA stuff and the like. Is it something that you should do? What should you expect? Well, the answer to the first question is a definite yes. There is plenty of good stuff to be found in the old JWA. You should obviously expect a slower pace and lots of battling in holds. The style of the JWA is very similar to that of contemporary American wrestling from the period, as that's what Rikidozan was taught in, and in turn, that was taught in the dojo. A lot of the main events are going to be Broadways, and there will certainly be draws, double countouts, and so on. This is not Kins Road by any stretch of the imagination, although it's definitely closer to what 1970s All Japan was. Giant Baba, as top star, was very capable of this sort of match. The 6'10" man with the rather odd body was always more athletic than he may seem, even channeling that when needed in his later years, but this is a time when Baba would happily go 60 minutes plus on command. One particular match that demonstrates Baba's strong athleticism comes from the JWA period, a July 1970 bout against Dory Funk Jr. in the Osaka Furitsu gym when a heat wave apparently made it so hot that contact with the mat would burn the wrestler's flesh. Despite rest holds being virtually impossible because of this, Baba and Dory Funk still went over 50 minutes to a double countout. A lot of Baba's frequent opponents would, of course, be champions themselves. He often faced the likes of Texas champ Fritz von Erich, WWF champ Bruno Sammartino, and the man he perhaps considered his greatest opponent of all, NWA champion Gene Kaniski, with one particular match against him, an August 1967 clash that sold out Osaka Stadium with well over 25,000 people, being cited by the man himself as his greatest ever bout. Japan vs USA was still the primary theme of every JWA card, and Baba was more than capable of maintaining that line. With him on top, Puroresu was now, once again, highly popular, and competition was only going to fan its flames. Said competition came from the aforementioned IWE, or International Wrestling Enterprise. This promotion managed to gain much more of a foothold than Toyonobori's short-lived Tokyo Pro. Indeed, the former Rikishi was one of its main stars alongside Hiro Matsuda and even Giant Baba's old US manager, Great Togo. January 24th, 1968 sees possibly the first time that two major promotions would butt heads on national television, with two cards going directly against each other. TBS runs an IWE card that features Lou Thesz taking on Danny Hodge for Thesz's original world title, one that apparently went all the way back to Frank Gotch, while NTV run a JWA card headlined by Giant Baba defending his title against Crusher Lisowski. The JWA won the day with a rating of 48, while the IWE earned 26. In short, a hell of a lot of people that day were watching wrestling, and pro wrestling's second big boom period is well and truly here. With this in mind, it's unfortunate that quite a lot of significant footage from this time, including the aforementioned Thesz-Hodge match, appears to be lost to time. Watchers of Showa-era pro-res from the 1960s have similar troubles to those who watch old TV shows from the time period, with lots of old footage either being lost or erased. There's not even that much footage out there of the BI Cannon team that we're about to cover. With competition from the IWE heating up and pro wrestling firmly back in the hearts of people across Japan, the decision was made to put the two big guys together at last. In October of 1967, Giant Baba and Antonio Inoki teamed together for the first time. The Baba Inoki team, known as the BI Cannon, will be the definite leading lights of this second boom. They may well have only been truly together for a few years, but they will win the NWA International Tag Team titles 4 times in that period for a combined total of 1,444 days with the straps, meaning they were champions close to every day that they were an active team. Over this time, they'll defend the belts against the best duos the US can offer: Crusher and Dick LaBruza, Sammartino and Ray Stevens, Danny Hodge and Wilbur Snyder, the Funk Brothers. It's quite the star-studded lineup, and the tag setting does allow for more clean finishes in these bouts. With the formation of the BI Cannon, Inoki is now unquestionably the closest to Baba when it comes to the home team and where they stand on the card. This somewhat annoys one of the other top stars, Kintaro Oki, who makes a pretty big noise about going to IWE. While this would have been a big coup, Oki is soon placated through being rewarded another old Rikidozan belt, the All-Asia Heavyweight title, and he stays with JWA. The IWE competition also sputters around this time. Hiro Matsuda leaves after a dispute with Great Togo, who then leaves himself soon after taking a beating from another wrestler, Gantetsu Matsuoka, and referee Yusef Turk in his hotel room. Thesz and the American talent follow soon after, and the IWE stand-in diminishes somewhat. However, they will still stick around as the number 2 promotion, headed up by stars such as Rusha Kimura and Thunder Sugiyama, while also bringing in foreign talent such as Vern Gagne and other AWA competitors, Billy Robinson and Andre the Giant. The IWE were actually the first pro-res promotion to bring Andre over. They were also the first Japanese promotion to win a steel cage match. The dream team of Baba and Inoki is popular enough for JWA to be enjoying the same sort of success that they were getting during the heyday of Rikidozan. Even if they may not necessarily have reached some of the man's craziest peaks, they have a consistency and stability. So it seemed, anyway. These are unquestionably good times, and JWA wants to consolidate that position. Indeed, they don't particularly want competition to crop up from anywhere, and media articles about Great Togo and Lou Thesz potentially setting up a new promotion, this despite Togo's ousting from JWA in the wake of Rikidozan's death, and somewhat violent running out of the IWE, gives them cause to be nervous. And so, well, why don't you start running your own competition? In 1969, JWA headed Togo and Lou Thesz, who it turns out was having his name co-opted by Togo's exercise and possibly wasn't remotely aware of the whole thing, off the pass by making a deal with a second network. NET TV, a once educational channel that had switched to general programming in the 1960s and would later be known as TV Asahi. The deal was fully completed in May of 1969, meaning JWA now had 2 weekly programmes, The Diamond Hour on Nippon TV and World Pro Wrestling on NET TV. A major part of this deal was that both networks would feature a star that was entirely exclusive to them and would not be shown on the other programme. NTV's was Giant Baba, and NET TV's was Antonio Inoki. In creating this deal, the JWA's locker room did indeed become somewhat split into 2, decades before anything like this occurred elsewhere. Those high up in the JWA may well have not considered the potential ramifications of doing this, thinking that it was just another deal, and that even if you had two factions in the locker room representing two different networks, there was no reason why they couldn't happily coexist. They were, of course, wrong. The ramifications of the deal didn't just involve Inoki and Baba, after all. Other guys were part of the split too. For example, young ex-judoka and hot prospect Seiji Sakaguchi would be with Baba on the NTV side, while the likes of Kintaro Oki and Katetsu Yamamoto would be with Inoki on the NET TV side. Inoki, surprisingly enough, was one of the first to voice a concern that this deal would cause factions to form in the locker room. And he'd be right, but a lot of the main friction came between the two networks themselves. There's even instances of NTV running counter-programming to World Pro Wrestling featuring Giant Baba, who's their guy, and reportedly wasn't big on this whole deal in the first place, while political machinations of cards backed by the networks increased to a huge scale. JWA haven't just created the quite significant rod for their own back, they've basically built a frickin' bomb and stored it under their table. And we'll see how all of this plays out. Despite all of this kerfuffle, there still really wasn't much at all in public to suggest that Baba and Inoki weren't firm friends who'd come up together and were now enjoying being at the forefront of the JWA and Puroresu. They'd still often take time to train together, usually with Carl Gotch whenever he, perhaps the foremost trainer of them all in wrestling, came over for a tour. Throughout the BI Canon days, and as a new decade began, everything was seen to be fine. However, for all the success, the pair did have a certain frustration, one that they may not have necessarily communicated to each other that well and would have certainly gone about trying to combat in different ways, but still one they shared. At various times, and usually individually, Baba and Inoki did make entreaties to the higher-ups at JWA to let them face each other, for the BI Canon to go off, in other words. Baba and Inoki hadn't faced each other in competition since their earliest days, and even if this tag team was so successful and making so much money, they both felt it important that they should face each other again. Not only would it likely be a huge success, but it would also be the first major rivalry between two native Japanese wrestlers, with Baba and Inoki going against each other for the NWA International Heavyweight title. Inoki certainly pushed the idea more than Baba, which you can probably expect. He was still very much the number 2 guy and wanted to show that he could be the number 1, although Baba himself was not at all opposed to facing Inoki at this stage. However, the JWA executives would consistently refuse them, neither wishing to upset the apple cart when it came to the deals they had with NTV and NET TV, nor wanting to deviate from the tried and true formula of Japan versus the rest of the world, mainly the United States. The inability of Baba and Inoki to get a match against each other continued to frustrate both of them, especially Inoki, and it was only a matter of time before one of these two would take matters into their own hands. And if you know these two well, I think you can hazard a guess as to who that was going to be. It took until May of 1971 for the incident to occur. For a change, it's not Inoki going to business for himself in a BI Canon match and firing live rounds on his partner. By this stage, Inoki has a singles title of his own, the NWA United National Championship, which he won in March after beating the veteran John Tolos in Los Angeles. The incident takes place during the annual World League tournament. This competition, won by Baba in 1966, 67, 68 and 1970, and by Inoki in 1969, had always been booked in such a way that Baba and Inoki wouldn't have faced each other during it, usually with Japanese wrestlers taking on foreigners. The end of the 1971 tournament sees Inoki wrestle the Destroyer to a double countout, meaning that Baba's semi-final match against Abdullah the Butcher is for the big prize. While that's going on, Inoki stages an impromptu press conference in his dressing room where he openly challenges Baba to a match, something that was absolutely not planned or agreed on, least of all by Baba. Following Baba's victory against Abdullah, Inoki even shakes his hand in the locker room, a rather awkward moment that's captured by a picture. The challenge was made official the following day and presented to the JWA's commission. After all this hoo-ha, the challenge is officially rejected on May the 28th, and it's pretty much confirmed that the big Inoki vs Baba match isn't going to happen. Needless to say, Inoki's big challenge to Baba generated a lot of media attention. It certainly sent tons flapping, and you'd have thought that these tons would have given JWA cause to actually give it the nod, although they held firm. The way Inoki went about the challenge made Giant Baba absolutely furious. Even if he wasn't opposed to facing Inoki, what he saw was Inoki going into business for himself, raising his own profile by using his name. There were other backstage goings-on that hardly helped matters, but Inoki's challenge to Baba on May 19th can certainly be thought of as the friendship ended point between the two. Inoki wasn't exactly shutting up about it either. In a refrain that would become very familiar over the years, he pointed to the JWA's rejection of his challenge to Baba as a tacit admission that he was the better wrestler and fighter all along. For Baba, Inoki going outside the traditional practices of the business in this way, not to mention all the smack that he was now thrown in his direction, was unforgivable. Truthfully, however, even if the BI Cannon tag team was such a success, the differences between Baba and Inoki were already quite marked. One of them was quite a reserved man who liked to keep a private life, while the other most certainly already relished the spotlight and all that came with it. Both Baba and Inoki would get married in the second half of 1971. While Baba's marriage to Motoko Kawai was a quiet ceremony in Hawaii that wasn't even made public until many years later, Inoki's marriage to actress Mitsuko Basho was an impossibly glitzy event that reportedly cost 100 million yen to put together. By this stage, the BI Cannon team was already a little on the rocks. Baba and Inoki hadn't had a lot to say to each other during a July title defence against Ivan Koloff and Dutch Savage, and afterwards Baba announced that he wished to take a short break from the Cannon. The tension is very much rising in JWA, and it doesn't just include those tensions between the two stars at the top of the company. Over the course of the next 12 months, everything is going to change. The plot started to take form in November of 1971, with the central figures being Inoki, another wrestler named Umanosuke Oida, and a disgruntled accountant named Akimasa Kimura. All three were primarily annoyed at how JWA was being run. Despite the success of the last few years, their finances were still not in particularly great shape, and they suspected that executives such as Kokichi Endo and company president Junzo Hasegawa, more famously known as Yoshino Sato, who had gone back to his real name since retiring from the ring in 1967, were regularly skimming money off the top. They wished to hold the coup in quite spectacular fashion. In December, after petitioning the locker room in support of reforms, they would perform a hostile takeover that got rid of Endo, Hasegawa and Michaki Yoshimura in one fell swoop while they were away at a golf tournament, with Inoki and Kimura taking the roles of president and vice president. The extremities of this plan was not exactly disclosed to all the wrestlers when they were petitioned about the possibility of reform, nor was it disclosed to Giant Baba when they discussed it with him. Baba recognised that there was certainly corruption, but thought it better that the execs stepped down gradually and gracefully, rather than essentially being decapitated all at once. As far as the plan to make Inoki and Kimura the heads go, it seems as though only those two and Oida knew about that. As far as wrestlers knew, there would be an extraordinary board meeting on November 28th. 2 days before that, however, Oida ratted out the conspirators. He informed Hasegawa and Yoshimura about the plot to replace them, also claiming that Baba himself was deeply involved. However, when Baba was grilled about it, it became clear that he didn't know the extent of Inoki's plan. For theories about just why Oida deviated away from the plot, and indeed a lot of details about this planned coup, I am referring a great deal to an excellent series of articles called Broken Crown, The Fall of Japan Pro Wrestling, written by Kinchstalker and linked to in the description. The general belief is that Oida didn't feel secure in his own standing after the coup had taken place. He felt that a lot of the origins of the plot came from disgruntled chats between himself and Inoki, but he wasn't guaranteed a place on the board following the coup, and possibly wondered if he may have taken something of a fall afterwards. With no guaranteed seat at the table, he decided to make the play. Plans were still going ahead, with Kimura appointed as an auditor in the wake of November 28th's board meeting. However, Inoki and Kimura were now planning to arrange the formation of a new company rather than take over JWA. Baba found out about this plan from Oida and promptly intervened, informing management of the plan, resulting in the immediate firing of Kimura. On December the 4th, Endo and Yoshimura made the decision to resign as executives, although they still retained roles in the company, while Baba stepped down from his less powerful role as chairman, with Kentaro Oki being promoted in his place. Oki, who had not been part of any of these reformation plans and long bore his own grudges over being passed over for the top face position, demanded, largely with the support of the locker room, that Inoki be expelled from the JWA immediately, even before the end of the current tour. This didn't happen straight away. There was enough time given for Baba and Inoki to wrestle one final and undoubtedly very cold match on December the 7th against the Funk Brothers, where they dropped the international tag team titles. Inoki didn't even return to the locker room after the match. He became aware of a plan to ambush and assault him as soon as he stepped foot back in there, and was whisked away to another room and then to a hospital in order to avoid such a thing happening. Antonio Inoki was officially fired from JWA on December the 13th, vacating the United National title, and the majority of the locker room were quite happy to see the back of him. There's even a picture where a lot of JWA wrestlers celebrate the sacking of Inoki with a toast. Baba himself very rarely commented on just what happened, but did so in the immediate fallout after Inoki and Kimura had branded him a traitor. He said that he and the wrestlers had supported reform in the company, but that Inoki's plan had gone well beyond that, and that he'd never had much trust for Kimura. If anyone could be branded a traitor in the fallout from this mess, it was Inoki. It's pretty fair to say that at this stage, any friendship or respect between the members of the once proud BI canon had now utterly disintegrated. As Inoki and Kimura licked their wounds in brief exile, they set about building the company that would become New Japan Pro Wrestling and would break in most every way from the old JWA style. Inoki gets back in touch with soon-to-be chairman Hisashi Shinma, an important figure who had previously been involved with the doomed Tokyo Pro, and Carl Gotch, his most important trainer, also comes into the fold. He even patches things up with Toya Nobori. The ex-Rikishi had retired in 1970, but came back in order to help New Japan for its first difficult year as an independent promotion, resolving to retire after the company found television. Meanwhile, the JWA may have looked forward to a less dramatic 1972, thinking that perhaps the drama of a coup was over. Giant Baba was still there, as was Kentaro Oki and Seiji Sakaguchi, who by now is right near the top of the card, pushed hard essentially to try and fill the big Inoki-shaped hole. A few wrestlers who are loyal to Inoki have departed with him, such as Katetsu Yamamoto and rookies Tatsumi Fujinami and Osamu Kido, but some at JWA might have thought, a bit naively, that the trash had fully been taken out. But really, the drama at JWA was just beginning, and a lot of it, quite frankly, would be of their own doing. The failure of the coup and ousting of Inoki hadn't exactly fixed the core problems with the company, and they were about to embark down a road that would soon alienate their biggest star. That and the end of the BI canon had also largely signalled the end of a boom period. Business was slowly winding back down again, and JWA had 2 networked shows to try and fill. NET TV, broadcasters of the World Pro Wrestling show, did want to increase the amount they paid JWA, but only if they could start featuring Baba, despite his exclusivity to Nippon TV. If JWA didn't agree to this, NET TV would drop the programme completely. Baba, who had pretty much been against the whole NTV NET setup from the beginning, absolutely hated this proposal. However, his political power had diminished following Inoki's coup attempt and Kentaro Oki taking the position of chairman as a result of that. And so the JWA board went ahead with it, and Baba started featuring on World Pro Wrestling from April. The response from NTV was perhaps predictable. Negotiations between NTV and JWA quickly broke down over the Baba exclusivity issue, and while JWA president Junzo Hasegawa thought that his federation was too big to just be dropped, well, he was won. NTV stopped broadcasting new JWA matches from May, terminating the Diamond Hour and broadcasting archived content in its place. The move from JWA to piss off NTV in this manner would prove, in every possible way, absolutely disastrous. Pretty much from that point on, Baba was looking to leave. In July, he flat out stated that he wanted to do business with NTV, not saying the obvious part in public, that he'd already started his own negotiations with the network, and there really wasn't an awful lot JWA could do about it. As much as some of JWA's die-hard wrestlers thought Baba to be another traitor and wished to do him a physical discourtesy, and as much as JWA tried their hardest to bring the giant back on board, there was little that could be done to change his mind on the matter. Baba's final tour with JWA took place in August, and his final match with the company happened on August the 18th. He was booked at one point for an international heavyweight title match against Oki in September, but suspecting that Oki was likely to shoot on him during the bout, he simply chose to vacate the title instead. On August 29th, Baba was officially gone from JWA and already deep in negotiations with NTV to start up his own wrestling promotion, the one that would eventually become All Japan Pro Wrestling. Whereas Inoki's New Japan struggled as an indie in its first year before finding television, AJPW moved fast, bolstered by already having the guarantee of TV programming. Several wrestlers who were loyal to Baba jumped ship with him, he made negotiations and secured agreements with the NWA as quickly as possible, he found another useful agreement with the IWE, and even landed agreement and blessings from the family of Rikidozan. His sons Mitsuru and Yoshihiro would soon start work for the company, while his widow Kiko, alienated by the JWA not long after her husband's tragic death, wouldn't just have a seat on the board of directors, she would give Baba custody of Rikidozan's two original versions of the International and All Asia heavyweight belts, the ones that only Rikidozan had ever worn. The message was absolutely clear. The true legacy of Rikidozan, the founding father of Pro-Res, no longer lied with the JWA. It was here with Giant Baba's AJPW. It's worth noting that the International Heavyweight title is nowadays a part of All Japan's main championship, the Triple Crown, alongside the old NWA United National and PWF Heavyweight Championship belts. All of these hammer blows, stemming directly from the JWA's terrible decision to shun Nippon TV, ended up being more than the original company could bear. The end of 1972, without Baba, saw their share of the market shrink to the point where they were below the IWE, and their deal with NET TV had turned a fair bit sour as a result. NET TV were now looking towards Antonio Inoki's New Japan. A proposed last-ditch merger with New Japan was the one thing that could have in any way saved them, only for JWA to back out at the last moment. Once again, they believed their own hype, and sides formed. You had guys like Kintaro Oki vowing never to do business with Inoki, and believing that JWA's status as the original Pro-Res company would save them. Breeze thinking that there was no way NET TV could abandon them completely. Seiji Sakaguchi, who'd been instrumental in setting up the prospective merger, was outmatched, and JWA decided to break off the merger. Once again, they'd made a terrible decision. With the merger abandoned, NET fully committed to broadcasting New Japan from March 1973, dropping all JWA programming in the process. The following month, on April 13th, a press conference was called at the grave of Rikidozan to announce the dissolution of the JWA. The majority of remaining JWA talent were merged into All Japan, where Baba's general disinterest in pushing them meant that they largely filled out the company's mid-card. Even the rookies who weren't guaranteed future ace and company star Jumbo Tsuruta were given preferential treatment over most of them. Sakaguchi would quickly join Inoki in New Japan. The mismanagement in the JWA was one reason why their business broke apart so spectacularly, in the midst of failed coups and foolish decisions that would see their most prized assets break apart acrimoniously, both with them and with each other. By the time that All Japan and New Japan formed, Giant Baba and Antonio Inoki were utterly fierce rivals. They had nothing but contempt for each other. Inoki would usually be the more vocal one, particularly during the earlier years of both companies, often commenting that if the pair ever had a proper fight, he would easily defeat his rival. Baba didn't often have too much to say in response, usually waving it away and saying that this was pro wrestling, not a street fight. Baba was more content to occasionally mock Inoki's exploits at legitimacy. A somewhat viral and almost purposefully terrible mid-card match pitting Baba against Raja Lion in 1987, a 7-foot-plus Pakistani actor who was presented as a master kickboxer, is basically a comedic parody of Inoki's worked bouts against legit martial artists and boxers like Everett Eddy, Willem Wesker and Chuck Wepner. The two had completely different visions on what wrestling should be, both had a tremendous amount of success when it came to selling that type of vision, but yeah, In the end, they were never destined to get along. A lot of people who knew and worked with both of them said that even if JWA had been run perfectly, they were almost certain to fall out. And in the end, a lot of that had to do with Baba being the top star as opposed to Inoki. Inoki was absolutely jealous of that, and ultimately his frustrations in JWA and motivation for staging the big coup was based on that. One other thing I think is also worth noting is that the Baba Inoki narrative is something that does repeat a few times in other major rivalries through the history of pro res. You see echoes of it in places like the career of Akira Maeda, who championed his legitimacy at the expense of what he would call regular pro wrestlers. You might see it most of all in the rivalry between Mitsuharu Misawa and Toshiaki Kawada. Kawada was an incredibly fit specimen, considerably fitter than Misawa, who often liked to party, certainly liked to smoke, and as ultra talented as he was, he didn't keep the same flawless level of conditioning that Kawada did. Inoki and Baba are quite similar in this regard, and just as Kawada was jealous of Misawa for being the top guy, even though he thought he was the superior athlete, the same was true of Inoki and Baba in the JWA. Now, if the shoe had been on the other foot, if Inoki had been the top star and not Baba, well, to be honest, as much as Baba is an entirely different, private, more reserved sort of person, I don't have too much reason to believe that Baba wouldn't have himself tried to replace him, albeit surely in a different sort of way, one that would perhaps have absolved him of any blame in the end. He was always the more subtle political player, as opposed to Inoki's sledgehammer. There is one last little epilogue of sorts. Despite the huge rivalry between Inoki and Baba and the legitimate dislike that they had for each other, the pair would, for one night only, team again. The final year of the 1970s would see an all-star dream card on August 26th, a one-off show promoted by the Tokyo Sports newspaper that featured New Japan, All Japan and the IWE joining forces in the Nippon Budokan, main evented by the BI Cannon going against Tiger Jeet Sin and Abdullah the Butcher. The show sold out the Budokan, was apparently the first $1 million gate in the history of pro wrestling as a whole, and there is at least a handheld version of the show available, which almost makes it seem like a mythical occurrence. As you might expect, however, it took quite a bit of work to get Baba and Inoki in the ring at the same time. Tokyo Sports put together the All-Star Dream card to celebrate the 20th anniversary of the newspaper, with the original idea of putting Baba vs Inoki on in the main event, alongside other All Japan vs New Japan Dream matches. However, the politics of booking such a card would quickly prove unfeasible, especially when it came to the main event. Eventually the card would largely feature teams of multiple federations against each other, and a decision was made to reunite the BI Cannon against a team of the fans' choosing, which ended up being the heel dream team of All Japan's Abdullah the Butcher and New Japan's Tiger Jeet Sin, whether that was the real result or not. Inoki, of course, certainly pushed for an Inoki vs Baba bout. It had after all been a familiar refrain for years by that point, but Baba was thoroughly negative on that front, also remarking coldly on the various comments against him that Inoki had made over the years. He did have a concern that if Baba vs Inoki did go ahead, there was the possibility that Inoki would shoot on him, even commenting to the organisers at Tokyo Sports that he didn't want to put himself in the boots of Masahiko Kimura, the man who Rikidozan had started firing live rounds on 25 years previously. Nevertheless, despite the odd rocky moment, as well as the odd moment where the pair's old friendship would actually return, albeit briefly, the BI Cannon reunion would go ahead. Just for one night, Japan's two most famous wrestlers put their differences aside for the greater good of celebrating pro wrestling as a whole, as well as celebrating the 20th anniversary of the nation's most famous sports paper. They went in, popped the crowd huge with their classic routine, took the requisite heat from Abi and Sin, got the victory through an Inoki backslide in around 13 minutes, shook hands, and even had a little hug afterwards. All seems like it goes off fine. Until, of course, Inoki gets on the microphone. Kinch is once again thanked for translating his words. He thanks everyone for coming, says that Lord James Blears, AJPW figurehead, has given positive encouragement to him about the prospects of a match between him and Baba, and says that the next time they meet in the ring, it would be a fight. Needless to say, this was not signed off on. Baba, who could barely hear Inoki and was himself barely audible in the crowd's delirium, did say "let's do it" in response, but backstage quickly reasoned that he'd hardly said anything binding and was reminded by the incident of exactly why he couldn't trust Inoki as far as he could throw him. Baba and Inoki would never share a ring again. This final incident involving the two is an odd one. As much as one could have hoped that there were more occasions like this, and that the bad blood between the two wasn't quite so intense, it also showed the huge gulf of differences between the pair, and rather neatly showed why neither were able to trust the other in the end. Inoki could have perhaps gotten over that, if only to find an opportunity to go into business for himself, but well, that is kind of why Baba, probably rightly, couldn't trust Inoki. The All-Star Dream card was a success, but there was pretty clearly no chance of a repeat performance afterwards. For Baba and Inoki, it's one more night when both their immense characters and personalities would come to the forefront, the very things that allowed them both to build such successful wrestling promotions. And that didn't just happen overnight when they both left the JWA. The story of both Baba and Inoki's time in Japan's first major wrestling company, from trainees to friends and tag partners to rivals, from colleagues to enemies, is a story of how the two most successful men in the history of Puroresu were made whole. Bye for now.